So the last update, we kind of showed you what the Outpost archetype is, the main shape language, how it's out on the surface. Whereas now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the branding and the integration and the detailing that we're going to put into the interiors.
So we're given a brief and it will be quite light in terms of narrative, and they'll say something like, Riari is a high-tech hydroponic lab that grows cutting-edge bioengineered plants, and they're used in medicine. So then they'll also say what the feel will be. It'll be like clean, organised, scientific, nice place to work. And I just convey that in a visual method. So this isn't just a process that can just be done in an instant. It's a progressive thing. So I'll do like a first iteration, and that will probably just involve maybe putting down a selection of props, and then I'll then pass that on to my lead and art director, and they will review it. And they will say, okay, maybe the feel here isn't quite what we need. We need something maybe a little more sterile or something a little more cleaner. Say, for example, something like the drugs farm, we need something a bit more sinister looking. So it's a process of layering the dressing and then building up an authentic atmosphere. So we go from that initial point and then we'll get to the end where we're kind of happy with it and we feel like when you walk in, then the player goes, wow, this looks cool.
Traditionally, what you'd do is you'd concept out your Vista shot and kind of describe where the location is. Whereas now with the tools we have, it's actually more natural, more organic to just have a little scout around. That way, you kind of get natural happy accidents. So for example, you might find a location where there's a nice kind of ridge line and then there's maybe a gas giant just peeking over the horizon, and then that's when we start saying this would be a good location. You also get that second element of believability where, rather than just putting down an arbitrary location, it's would people actually build there, but this way we can almost validate the location. Is it believable? Would people build there? And then that's when we can start establishing our compositions.
I've found a lot of times where I've decided on a place for an outpost and I've dropped the type point down, and then I fly maybe a mile to the left and I think, oh, this is a much better place to put that outpost. Delete the old one, move my type point, drop it down there, and it's the process of 30 seconds. So, it's very quick to iterate on. I do basically fly around a moon and think, oh, this is much better. Oh, the gas giant hanging in the sky just here really looks good, so let's put an outpost here. And I tend to move things around quite a lot.
So secondly, about integration and believability, it comes to the surfacing, the weathering. So when you see an outpost, you kind of should see an indication about how long he's been in that landscape, the type of climate that's been happening there, and thirdly, the type of people that live in this location. So these three factors go a long way for describing, the visual style of this location. So if one of these elements is slightly off, then it'll kind of break that immersive element. So it's something we always pay attention to.
Then we integrate these outposts onto the planet, and basically that just means how it fits in. If it's a sandy planet, you want the outpost to have some of that to help it embed it, and it doesn't look like it's floating on this planet and it's nothing to do with the environment. Obviously it's an environment and it will take part of that on. And we have several levels of how we integrate our outposts onto a planet's surface. We've got the outpost itself, the exterior walls and the ramps and the stairs. They have a blend map which takes on some of the texture information from the outpost. Some of that's done procedurally, so by the base of the outpost it actually uses a bit of tech to blend the planet surface into the texture of like the stilts and the ramps. And then we have our actual walls having their own blend map, so if it's a sandy one, it will blend. Sand will come in the gaps and the crevices, and then the icy one, the same kind of thing. Ice will build up like frost. If it's like in a jungle environment or more lifelike biome, then you might get moss or vines or something like that. So that's the sort of blending we do on there. And then we do the decals themselves, so that's like projected decals of similar things, but we can do a bit more localized kind of build up, so streaks of coming down the outpost and build up on the roof of the outpost. So if there's been a sandstorm, then it's blown over the top, and we can show that. We can actually control the amount of build up itself. So using the blend maps, we can see how new this outpost is. Is it sort of quite recent? It might only have patches of dirt around, or has this outpost been on there for many years, and it's sort of, maybe it's abandoned and it's got stuff coming inside as well, and it's covered, like you imagine like an Arctic base has been there for many years. It would be covered in just frost and ice, and you only get those hints of what the underlying wall might be.
So on the interiors, we've been defining what these spaces actually are. So rather than just having these generic volumes, we've been defining what the archetypes are. So, if you're going into an engineering space or a medical or habitation, things like that. Secondly, it's about the brand, the who owns this place. So we usually get a good brief from the lore team, and that's our starting point.
There are different corporations that we have for the outposts. So, for example, we have Reari Corporation and Shubin Interstellar Corporation. There are slight differences between these two. So the Reari Corporation is probably a better place to work. It's more pleasurable for the employees, and they focus more on sort of agriculture. The Shubin, on the other hand, is maybe slightly more oppressive. It's not as probably as pleasant a place to work.
In order to do the branding of the outposts, we first get the information from the writers, the lore and the narrative. So what these outposts are, what company owns them, if they're a company or if they're independent, and what's the sort of general theme and narrative of that company, and how it looks and how it's dressed and things like that. So, for example, if it's Shubin, it would be very corporate. It's a really big corporation. It's kind of sterile. They don't necessarily treat their workers badly, but they're sort of like just their workers, and there's not a lot of character there. Something like Riari's still corporate, but it's a little bit more considered like a nicer place to work. So you should see that in the way it's dressed and even the layout and things like that. And then you've got like the more run-down corporations like ArcCorp that feel more dirty. They really don't treat their workers very well. And then you have the independent companies, so they wouldn't be as dirty necessarily, but they wouldn't be as tidy as a corporation. They'd have a bit more character because they're kind of like a home from home. So someone saved up a bit of money, managed to sort of buy up a mining machine and started their own little independent. So they'd be more character. It might be a bit messier, but they'd be living there as well. That's kind of interesting too. That lore and stuff, which should be shown in the dressing, so you should be able to see what kind of company it is just by that. But then we've obviously got the actual branding, like the logos, and the color scheme. So we go about that by instead of doing all this stuff bespokely with materials, we feed in our colors, like our primary, secondary, tertiary colors, and any kind of logo colors and graphical stuff as well into DataForge, which is just a library of data really, and then that feeds back into the materials. So we don't manually make like lots of different materials with different colors. We just put in our RGB values, and then those colors get fed in. So whoever owns, say, this mining station, if it's Shubin, then it will tie into that color scheme and take that. So it's a nicer way than having to manually do everything. And then we've got the logos themselves. So we have like an atlas of logos and idents and lines and fonts and things like that, and then they get fed in as well. So if Shubin owns this, then it takes this whole set of materials. And then if Riari owns it, then it takes that set of materials. And if it's an independent, maybe it doesn't even have a logo. And we try not to like just plaster logos everywhere. We want to be a bit more subtle. You'd obviously see some, but depends on the corporation. But we don't want to see like Riari everywhere you look. So some corridors might just have like a certain colored line that help you link that to the company, and there might be some, not necessarily logos, but just symbols and things dotted around. Again, just reinforcing that brand. So that's how that's done. And and it's great that it's all procedural. So we can just drop one down, say, okay, this is this one, this is ArtCorp. It automatically, I mean, there's a lot of setup, but it will take the color scheme and the logos from that.
It becomes an incredibly complex job when you have to consider so much about the way the surface of the planet works. And these environments aren't just a static level that is going to look the same every time you go back to it. They'll be in a constantly evolving kind of spinning planet that eventually is going to be orbiting the sun in a way that makes sense. It's a lot to sort of think about. So you have to consider things like vistas and lighting are going to change. And you can't, as an environment artist, you can't pick a perfect place to put an outpost and know that it's going to always look like that. So we have to make sure that we're working towards environments that look good in many different scenarios, because as the moon rotates, it's going to go from day to night. So we have to make sure that it looks good at night and day, but it's the same outpost. So there's a lot of systems talking to one another there. And it's a complex task. If we think about the eventual purpose of making this entire process at least semi-automated, we can't maintain individual outposts. So we could make an outpost by hand and export it to a level. That's an easy job. But if you think about having to make 1,000 outposts by hand and exporting each one of those to the level, that's 1,000 outposts we have to maintain. If we go back down the chain all the way to that initial geometry prefab, if there's something breaks in an outpost over here, then all we have to fix is one prefab over here. Whereas if something broke in an outpost that was custom, we wouldn't be able to fix it across all the other outposts at the same time. It would only ever be fixed in that custom outpost. So in a procedural system, you're only ever dealing with pieces, but you fix one of those pieces, you fixed all the pieces in every instance of that outpost that is around. So it may be complex now in terms of initial setup, but once the pipeline tools come in, it should be a lot easier to maintain than if we were making 1,000 custom outposts. So that's the reason, really. It's initial complexity and initial sort of beating your head against the wall of trying to figure out the system. But once that system is in place and once the tools are in place, the end result is quick and easy to get, and it also is a lot easier to maintain.
So in terms of how I use the editor, I'll be given like a set of brushes, probably from props guys, and I'll also get requests for other props, because when I construct the scenes, it'll probably go off my art director and he'll say, look, we need something more on the ceiling. And so lately I've been making a lot of ceiling pieces. And these could be, for example, in the labs, they needed something more technical looking. So what I've done, I've created more ceiling vents, positions for lights particularly. So I work quite heavily with our lighting artist, and he'll say, I need, some sort of like degree angles in order to put more lights onto it to illuminate areas of the room, which if it was just a flat ceiling would be quite difficult to do. So giving him these options, he can do his job more effectively. We work with prefabs as well, and these are usually pre-constructed brushes. These can have things like lights in and sound effects and stuff like that. So when I put them down, they're kind of all ready to go, and gives a more immediate sort of look as to what we require.
So because we've got all these systems talking to one another, we have a lot of complexity in the way these things are built. And just as an example, the outposts at the moment, in a traditional game, you would probably put all your geometry together, light it in an editor, and export that level, and it will go into the game. Quite a two-step process. For the outposts, we start with a geometry. We put those into a geometry prefab. A collection of geometry prefabs goes into a building piece prefab. Those building pieces then go into a final building, e.g. an outpost. Those outposts go into an object container that gets put into an outpost cluster preset. That preset gets spawned on the moon. The moon with its presets gets put into another object container. That object container goes into the solar system, and the solar system gets exported to the game. So there's a multi-linked chain of stuff that we have to maintain and manage. And all this is reliant on naming conventions and file structures. So we're working really hard at the moment. Basically, the tech artist who wrote it, Alex, who you've already talked to, tried it himself. And this is the system he wrote. He couldn't manage it. It was too complicated. So we are working very hard at the moment to basically take all that middle section out completely and automate it, so that the artist will only ever be involved with that initial start and all the way through to the preset creation and putting the presets onto the moons. All the middle bit with the multiple prefabs and presets and object containers is all going away and should be completely automated, because asking an artist to maintain that level of complexity while at the same time being creative is an impossible request. So our tools guys and our tech artists are working very hard to make that as streamlined as possible, but it's becoming more and more complex as we go along. It relies on us basically building a rule set and a set of automation that makes it completely invisible to an artist and an end user, because otherwise people are going to go insane.
What we're looking to do is have the idea of, you have quite a vast landscape, and the player kind of locates one of these outposts. They should start thinking about how long's it been there, who owns it, and things like that. And what we're looking to do is layer that narrative from the outside to the inside, or so all the way down to how the food is arranged on the interior, across from the outside to the interior space. The player should start getting those notes of the narrative all the way through. And I think in contrast to these barren landscapes, to these pockets of quite intense detail, it's quite a nice contrast. So now we're getting a really good idea of how it feels for the player to explore and kind of traverse around these locations. So we're continuing to polish, but continuing to refine and just get that experience to a very high standard. So we're looking forward to the next release and then getting it out to the public and get people exploring.